Happy Wednesday to everybody joining this call. We wait and see how many people are kind of coming in for a second. But as we start to get going, I'm going to go ahead and launch a couple of polls since our topic today revolves around the RFP process. We'd like to get a sense of where you're at in relation to a potential current RFP or possibly a future RFP that you're waiting on. So our first poll question is going to be to find out a bit more about you as our attendee from that perspective. And really we have two poll questions. The other is just to get a sense of your experience level. Are you a novice? Are you an expert? So that we sort of have a general idea of where everybody is at from a knowledge standpoint. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch that right now so that you can go ahead and take it. So as we kind of continue, we'll cover the results of this in a couple of minutes, but I'll go ahead and say, my name is Chris Lasky. I'm with Altai Systems, and we'd like to thank you for taking time to join us on this critical topic. You won't really be hearing much from me on this webinar, as we have two exceptional presenters here sharing their experiences, which I'll let them tell you about personally in a moment. But my sort of role will be to monitor the chat, and we highly encourage any interaction that you can put in there, responses to things you've heard, questions that you may have along the way, and I'll try to interject and bring those things up as we go along. Looks like we're getting in some responses fairly well. So as we sort of wait on those, I'll go ahead and sort of wrap up my portion of this and say we've got with us today Beth Power from Altai Systems and Tammy Marco with A-Church Consulting. Together they have a tremendous amount of experience with this topic and bring fantastic perspectives. We're excited to bring them together on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to Beth so that we can start to look at some of the results that we are having come in.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much. Again, I am Beth Power with Altai Systems, and I'm with Tammy Marco from A-Church Consulting. A little background about us. I worked at the American Bar Association for 20 years, both in the marketing side and IT. So before moving to the vendor side, so I've got a big background in association and sort of what it's like to write the RFP from that side, and now what it's like to receive the RFP from the vendor side. And then Tammy, can you give a little background about your experience?
Sure, thanks, Beth. So I'm Tammy Marco. I have worked in the association space for about 13 years. I've been an IT director at 2 different associations, both professional and trade organizations. Now I work on the consulting side to provide a couple of different areas for support. I provide fractional CIO services, which is when a smaller organization doesn't have enough budget or enough need for a full-time CIO. I step in as a part-time CIO and create policies, IT strategy, support of other variety of needs. But the other area that I support is helping through clients through different system selections, whether it's an AMS or an LMS, email marketing, you name it. The system selection is, and its associated RFP is what Beth and I are going to talk about today during our webinar. But first, I think Chris might have some results from the first poll.
Yeah, I see that, the top 2 here, that people are just interested in the topic, but still a ways off from the RFP, or they're getting ready to start a new RFP. I think it's always good to be aware of sort of having it in the back of your head when even if you're not ready to do an RFP, sort of getting a sense. And I listen to a lot of podcasts that may not be relevant right when I'm doing something, but just having that sort of, I don't know, maybe osmosis that is getting into my head through my earphones, and that's really sort of helpful to sort of, as I start to get into something, I'm like, oh yeah, I listened to that. So I love that there are a lot of people who aren't quite ready to do an RFP yet, but are just learning the topic. And then what the results for what experience level, I've assisted in 1 or 2 or spearheaded 1 or 2. I suspect that's probably not far off for associations. You when you get an AMS, you're kind of committing for a few years. And so if I know the last AMS I put in, we all vowed in the war room that we had been in for 2 years, we would never do that again. I'm grateful that technology has changed and has become a lot easier to implement. But Tammy, do you have experience of, the people you work with, how often they generally do RFPs?
Yeah, similar to what you had suggested, an RFP in a big system like that, whether it's an AMS or an LMS, you typically hang on to it. You want to hang on to it for, 5, 7, 10, well, I say 10 years, but maybe that might be getting a little bit long. So yeah, so there's typically some experience with writing an RFP, but usually it's gotten a little bit dusty. And so because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, so I'm glad that everyone's here today across the experience platform or experience range. So let's go into sort of what we're going to cover today. So as we think about RFPs, we want you to actually think a little bit outside the box. And do you even need an RFP? And if you do, what sort of role would a consultant play if you choose to use one, or should you use one? Are you using the RFP as requirements gathering or feature assessment? 4 things to consider ahead of the RFP. I think there's 1 or 2 that might come as a surprise to you. How to construct a good RFP question. We're also going to tell you what not to do in constructing an RFP question. And once you start getting those results, are you comparing apples to oranges sometimes? And once you do get those results, what comes next as they start to come in? So the first one, do you even need an RFP? Chris has another poll to sort of get a sense of what your association requires. You see that first bullet there. What's your association policy of requiring an RFP? We would love to know sort of the background for this group. I can speak from experience that at the ABA, we were required to do RFPs, and we're required to sort of re-up that sometimes, even if we weren't necessarily going to select a new system. It was part of the procurement process to make sure that we were constantly, well, not constantly, every few years, reviewing our technology to make sure we were still using the system that we needed to use. So we'll give you a minute to answer this question. So hopefully Chris sees some results coming in.
Yeah, and Beth, I was going to say the same for organizations that I've worked at. Some of them did not require an actual RFP, but they did require bids from multiple vendors, maybe 2 or 3 vendors, in order to support the pricing and the rationale behind why you chose that vendor. So,
yeah, I would think that especially sometimes in an association where, so there we go. So more than half, just over half, do require an RFP, probably in part for that competitive bid price. So I do think that that's another reason why you would do an RFP, not just because of the policy, but baked into that policy is the competitive bid pricing. If you don't do this very often, or if that's not, if you're reporting to a board of lawyers or doctors or whatever, they might not have any sense of how much some of this technology would cost to know if you're sort of in the right range. And you might be doing it for feature assessment. An RFP forces you to sort of think about what you need in a system, and you might be doing it as that feature assessment. But for the feature assessment, that's where it sort of comes into, do you even need to do this RFP? And if you are, what's the role of a consultant? Tammy, that's where you come in. Can you talk a little bit about what the role of a consultant is here?
Sure. Thanks. So there are a lot of factors that going into deciding whether you should explore a new system or not, or need an RFP or not. And many times when you're exploring new systems, that comes from, many months or many years of manual process, or staff is managing their process outside of what the system is that they should be using. And it really comes to a boiling point where staff and leadership are saying, there has to be a better way. We can't continue doing it in this way. So if vendor selection is a regular part of your job and managing this type of process is something that you or your team have bandwidth to do, maybe a consultant isn't something that fits in your budget or even your need. But a consultant adds value beyond managing just the process. So a consultant can help you derive your high-level requirements. We can help identify what's working, but also really listen to what the key challenges are, what the current system is across the board. We can help identify what those common themes are. And ultimately that's used to help build a set of high-level requirements. A lot of times I find that there are some commonalities of requirements across clients that I work with, but each of them really has their own nuances that fit their specific organization's business needs. So notice when I was talking about requirements, I talked about high-level requirements. So we're going to talk about that more in just a bit. When it comes down to narrowing your target list, a consultant can also help you target your list of vendors or software products that really meet your needs. We have an understanding of the marketplace. We have an understanding then of what your key requirements are. And while the idea of sending out your RFP to a whole lot of vendors might sound like a good idea in theory, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of your time and your staff's time to review each of those responses. I'd say on average, it takes somewhere between 3 and 4 hours for staff to review each RFP response. So you really want to be focused on who is receiving your initial RFP so that you're getting responses back that truly could be potential fits for you. So I'm working with a client, or I was working with a client who has a certification program, and it was their intention at the beginning of the effort to go through a full AMS selection, and then they also wanted to go through a full certification management system selection. And after listening to what their requirements are, I helped them realize that they could likely find what they were looking for, both from their association management perspective and their certification capabilities in one AMS platform rather than in 2 separate systems. And so for them, the list of potential vendors was really targeted to those who provided AMS features, but who could also support robust certification capabilities.
Man, I just need to interject there. That makes me break out into a sweat with thinking of doing 2 implementations on 2 different systems at the same time. So I'm so glad you were able to steer your client to look at more of a system holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and consultants have an understanding of the industry leaders. We have regular exposure to these systems and these vendors, whether it's from other system selections that we've gone through or implementations for that matter. Also from technology events and technology events that take place, such as ASAE Technology Conference or AMS Fest. We really know who the players are. And, in that example that I just mentioned about my client with the AMS and certification needs, that client had been on their AMS platform for 15 years. And their staff really didn't have an understanding of the industry leaders and would not have known, which vendors to seek out. So that's an area that a consultant can definitely help with. One other area that is important that a consultant can help you navigate is making a fit from an organizational culture perspective. It's a really important aspect that sometimes you don't think about. Some clients are looking for large organizations. Some are seeking more of a boutique vendor. When it comes to support, some are looking for really large support teams, and others are more interested in like a white gloved approach. So all of these things are different aspects to consider when going through the RFP process. But a consultant can help, not only with these other things, but also with managing the process itself, because staff already have a full-time job and it takes a lot of time to manage this type of process. It can be difficult to manage the selection process for your staff during the day and then have them do their day-to-day work in the evening. So a consultant can help work through that with you. We can alleviate some of those time constraints, with interacting with the team and the vendors, obviously with the documentation of the RFP itself, which includes all of those high-level requirements. So speaking of requirements, let's talk for a minute about that. When you're generating your requirements, make sure to resist your RFP becoming your discovery phase, and be open to adjusting your scope when a tool presents itself to meet new needs. it's a very important step in the process is for you and your consultant potentially to have a solid understanding of what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Are you trying to update your infrastructure, or your systems have reached end of life? Maybe you have specific needs that are just no longer being met by your system. Maybe you're just not set up for success and technology is sort of passing you by, and your technology is, you're being left behind because of your technology. And all of those things are really valid reasons to look for a new system, but it doesn't really tell you, or your prospective vendors for that matter, what it is that you're really looking for. So you'll have to really be able to articulate what your specific requirements are and, provide a broad vision. But be careful that the RFP doesn't turn into your detailed requirements gathering process. At this stage, when you drill into the very specific details, you can sometimes try to engineer or over-engineer the solution. And that is not helpful at this point. And I'll just give you a quick example. Let's say you know that you need to integrate with your email marketing platform, right? So the requirement can be as simple as your system must integrate with whatever your email marketing platform is. It can be that simple. You don't need to spell out the exact queries that you currently have. You don't have to spell out exactly how your integration takes place, because you're not trying to replicate what you have currently. You're trying to utilize and leverage capabilities that exist in the new system. So instead, you want to tell the vendor why you need to do the integration, or give them examples of what your current challenges are, instead of telling them how to implement it. Because the journey really does give you insight, really good insight along the way. You can learn new features or capabilities that exist in your new system to help you really resolve and alleviate your problem, maybe in a different way than you were originally thinking. So allow enough breathing room for the vendor to make suggestions of how things can be done, or even articulate experience that they have had with other clients in making it successful. They have worked with many other clients, not just you, so they have a whole lot of exposure to bring to the table of what has worked and what hasn't worked. So keep your list of needs at a slightly higher level to identify the pain points in your key requirements. Again, and it doesn't matter what type of system this is, whether it's an AMS or an LMS or a CMS, the concept is really, is really for the most part the same. So Beth, can you talk to us a little bit about things to consider leading up to the RFP?
Sure. This slide says 4. I really think that there are 5 things, but we took one out, and that's vendor management, because we've already talked a lot about it. We'll continue to talk about sort of managing the vendor and how that becomes an extension of your staff. And we wrote a recent blog post about this. We'll share it with you after the webinar, but 4 things that we really want to sort of focus on here. First is change management. You're probably all exhausted about hearing change management, or change fatigue has set in after all the change you've sort of been going through in the last year. It's real. I mean, I get it. I feel it too. But there's some good side and upside to that. Your leaders and your C-suite team have already seen how well you have adapted and how well you have changed in the last year. So this is a really good opportunity to not just sort of look at what new technology, but what new business processes you might be able to implement too. So associations can be slow to change. And this is an opportunity somewhere, and I've heard this multiple times, that we essentially did the world holistically did 2 years worth of technology advancements in 2 months because of COVID. So associations were forced to do that too. And so now's a good time to sort of, continue that momentum and look at other ways that you might change. And as you're looking at systems, how can your business processes change with that? Tammy, can you talk a little bit about the data management change or data management to consider?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm going to mention one thing about change management though,
Yeah.
Is, just because a new system is implemented doesn't mean that it's going to roll out successfully for your team. So you have to think about ways to go about communicating that change and that change management to your staff so that they can then proactively plan and prepare themselves for that new system. So when it comes to a data perspective, you should definitely think about what current data sources you have. And in many cases, after being on a same platform for many years or even decades for that matter, it can lead to leveraging a really wide variety of external tools. And so you sort of have this MacGyvered solution with all of these external data sources. So think about what those data sources are and what the data is that can help you better understand your customer. When you're looking at a new system, you can also think about how you can try to bring in some of the features from those external data sources and see how your new platform might be able to take over for that piece of functionality. So instead of having 8 external systems, maybe you only really need 3 or 4. So when you're thinking about data, it's also really important to start small and start clean. You don't want to muddy up your new system with data that is dirty or data that doesn't really provide you any value. So make sure to keep that into consideration. By making smart choices throughout the process, it can allow you to have faith in your data, and it can allow you to be able to report on the data in digestible ways that can allow you really to make data-driven decisions. So Beth is going to share about HR related aspects.
Yeah, this one might seem a bit of a surprise for some people. A lot of what you're going to hear when you're looking at new systems is about automation, and people might hear that and think, oh, you're going to automate me out of a job. And so that goes to the change management and making sure, as Tammy said, that you're preparing, the association holistically as to the new systems. But automating something doesn't mean that you're going to eliminate a job. It just means you're sort of freeing up time for that staff person to spend more time on new projects that you don't have the time for, or to better serve your member in new and interesting ways that the new system will now allow. So this is really a good opportunity to not just manage those concerns, but to sort of have some career development for your staff. So upskilling is really important at this point. There's lots of systems that are sort of low code, no code. You'll hear citizen developer and things like that there might be skills that they need to use. I know someone who is in marketing who says, when they were hiring, they used to really focus on copywriting and things like that. And now it's really, do you have the skill sets to manage marketing automation? And what is your tech skills for that? So having your staff be upskilled in knowing how to do some of that helps their career development. It helps employee satisfaction, and it helps you acquire new people when you're hiring, because it's skill sets that are maybe a little bit more universal and things like that. And so there's really good opportunity to help your staff come with you on this journey to a new system. You also go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, go ahead.
So I was just going to add, you had talked about hiring, with hiring new staff. It'll be important also to incorporate some of these new technologies in the position description that you have out there, because, the need for a new system, it can necessitate different skills. And so you'll want to update whatever that position description looks like. Also, for your existing employees, it might also be important to update what their job description is, because it may have changed as a result of implementing this new system. So I actually worked at an organization in order to ensure that adoption took place. They actually incorporated the learning of this new system and the effective usage of the system in their annual goal statement. That's how important it was to that organization to ensure that staff adopted it, that it was mandatory that everybody had to adopt and learn this tool as part of their annual goal.
That's great. I mean, that's great. And getting adoption for members as well becomes another sort of challenge and something to consider. Can you talk a little bit about that side as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the AMS, we're talking about system selection, but a lot of times it isn't a new AMS that clients are looking for. So the AMS is really as much about your membership as it is about your staff. And while you certainly want to streamline the processes for your staff, you definitely want to have areas improvement for your membership as well. There's so many different new capabilities out that can streamline processes for your members. I mentioned all of those external data sources. In many instances, a customer can't log on to your portal and see every transaction that interacts with all of those different external systems. So this is an opportunity for you to really improve the member experience as well. It really should be a win-win for both you and your membership as well. So why don't we dive into constructing questions that go into the RFP?
Yeah, this is where we would love to hear from you as we go through this. Are there questions that you have seen or written that you regret feels like a strong word, but that you wish you wouldn't have done in the past, that you that you want to do different next time? Or are there questions that you ask every time and they feel like such a good indication of how successful something's going to be? Do you have any questions you want to share with the group? We'll make sure that Chris is watching the chat and can sort of pipe in. But some do's and don'ts to start with. I'm going to start with that first don't. Don't ask only yes or no questions. Do you have security? That everyone's gonna, if you get someone that says no, I guess that's an easy way to like knock them out. But generally, everyone's gonna say yes. And so it's not do you have security, but ask them how they do their security, or ask them how do they manage their security at the user screen and field level. Get into sort of asking them how. Essay questions may have been sort of the bane of your existence in high school or college, but they're important ways to sort of both sort of understand what type of vendor you're getting and get sort of a feel for that, but also a good way to sort of have them explain something beyond a yes or no. Sure, there's going to be some yes or no questions, but getting them to tell you the how allows you to do a little bit of that. Hey, I don't know what I don't know. And so they might say something about a question that sort of sends you in a different direction. Ask them to tell you why, or you tell them why you need specific functionality. Again, don't engineer the solution. Let them tell you what their solution is as to why you need or how you can do something based on what your specific functionality is. On the flip side, if you sort of ask too generic of a question, again, back to the, do you have security? That's not really going to tell you anything. And so you want to be, get a little bit into the weeds of asking that specific functionality. I know that I have a desire to get in the weeds sometimes. I kind of like the weeds, and that's okay sometimes, because it is things that might seem really obvious to you might not be so obvious. So there on that flip side, don't get lost in the inside baseball. If you use too much of your own terminology that might not be industry-wide, there might be some opportunity for confusion, which is why sometimes the weeds are good for things that you think are super obvious, but maybe aren't as obvious. I like to use this example of, and you've probably heard this, where everyone in a room is asked, take a sheet of paper, close your eyes, take a sheet of paper, fold it in half again, rip a corner or whatever. And then when everyone opens their eyes, everyone's is different. So having them, so this sort of goes to all of the do's. You're telling them what you need, you're giving them that sheet of paper, and how they come back might all be different. And it might be a way you haven't even thought of, but they need to know a little bit, and then let them sort of give them the opportunity to really sell themselves in a way that can send you in a direction you didn't realize. So get specific enough, especially if it's a showstopper type of issue, but give some room to breathe, I guess, and let them show you what they have. But Tammy, you probably have had lots of questions. Are there things that you want to sort of talk about here that can sort of dispel any concerns of writing a question?
So I don't have specific questions of what to write and not write, but one thing to keep into consideration is the RFP response isn't the end all be all. You're not making a selection based on the RFP response. So you can get your question detailed enough so that you can glean enough information for the response to then know how to drill into more detailed questions when you get into the demo phase. So keep in mind that the RFP responses, that's not the end of the process. There's time to be able to see how different functionality and features that you may not be aware of, see how they can unfold and how you might be able to leverage them in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So like so many things in life, it's all about balance. And so, you know, when you go too far into the weeds, you need to be careful. And when you get too high level, you need to be careful because you're not getting enough. And so finding that right balance that you're going to get enough to go to the next stage is so important. And that balance can, you know, it's, you know, you'll get it wrong sometimes, and hopefully more often you'll get it right. And the more you do these and the more you bring in a consultant or sort of do webinars like this that sort of talk about best practices, but it's finding that balance of getting enough out of it, but not being too generic to do that.
We've had a great question kind of pop up in the chat that I'll bring up, and they ask, do you list a budget or financial range in the RFP? Tammy, what are your thoughts on that?
Right, so this is just my own perspective from a consultant perspective. I never list the budget or the financial range of, I never list that in the RFP itself. Because what ends up happening is in the RFP, you're typically giving your high level wish list of everything that could be encompassed in your project. And in many cases, your full wish list isn't your set of needs. It also includes your wants. And so you can always tailor some of those back and prioritize some of your requirements in order to fit what your real budget is. So I let the vendors sort of take a look at our entire list to give us what a scope is to complete the full feature set, knowing that we may not do all of it right out of the gate. So from my perspective, I just leave it very generic and don't provide a range. Beth, what about you?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, certainly the range, there's value in understanding the range for making sure that the vendors aren't, like if it's a vendor who, you know, if you're an association and you've got a budget of some, you know, I'm going to say some $10,000, some ridiculously low number relative to what, you know, might actually be the reality. I mean, if your budget is super small, then that really helps. Like you don't want to waste your time with somebody who, you know, is used to doing budgets of or implementations of $1 million, you know, implementations or something like that. So it does help in some ways to sort of narrow your focus for the right vendors to be bidding for you. But I definitely understand what your budget is and what you're sort of asking for in the RFP might be pretty different. And so, you know, if you're it's sort of leading the witness a little bit too much, and so not giving too much away does make a lot of sense. And so there's value to give a little bit of a range, but I totally appreciate the don't lead the witness and let them sort of say what it is for the full scope, and then you can sort of negotiate from there with the different departments in your association of like, okay, it's gonna this thing that you say you really need is going to cost this much money. How much do you really need it versus can we push that to a phase 2, or, you know, we don't want to lose these other showstopper features and things like that.
Yeah, and one other thing that I was going to mention is when you use a consultant, they can also understand what your budget is ahead of time and then help you target your your vendors, your proposed vendors to send the process to. A consultant can help you in that respect also.
That's a good point. Chris, did we have any other questions right now?
Not at this point, but I think those were both excellent responses to that question, and we appreciate that question. It was a good topic.
Great. So keep the questions coming if it's something we've already talked about or something that you want clarification or something else that you hope we get to. We're going to sort of go on to comparing apples to oranges. Tammy, this is sort of your area of expertise. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So once you've drafted a really good RFP and you shared it out with those vendors and the responses are coming in, it really can be like comparing apples to oranges sometimes. The formats of the responses can be different. The terminology that they use across vendors can be different. The licensing requirements can be different. And so it is sometimes hard to compare all of the different responses. But at the end of the day, you're really trying to narrow down the vendors that can realistically fit with your organization, your staff, and for a successful implementation. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you really need to verify that the system meets your core needs. And the thing to keep in mind is that not one system is going to fit all of your needs. You may have to prioritize, sort of like we were just talking about with that budget discussion. You may have to prioritize and focus on those requirements that are really the core of your business. And you'll need to potentially think about trade-offs. Again, coming along with that budget question, is the system within your anticipated budget? Sometimes the vendors give enough information and pricing details so you can see where the bulk of the costing is coming from. And in some of those instances, you can take your prioritized list and maybe phase out, maybe have multiple phases to your approach, focus on what is necessary to get your business running today, but be excited about some of those new feature sets that you can grow into the future and maybe phase some of those things out. And as I mentioned before, the organizational and cultural fit is really important also. Some associations really want a more boutique feel and relationship. Others are really looking for that well-oiled machine. And a consultant can help you navigate in that area.
I have something to add about sort of that budget as and to tie it back to the change management that we talked a little bit before. So I know that as someone who has sort of been on the side doing the implementation and the side needing the implementation done, that there's always fear that phase 2 won't ever happen. And so there's always this push to get it all in. And in the past, that was probably true when you sort of did sort of waterfall, everything goes in at once. And now the philosophy of sort of an MVP, the minimal viable product, and sort of more of an agile approach allows you to truly believe that there's going to be a phase 2, but some of that might be some change management that you need to sort of manage internally. So fitting within your budget and being accepting that some things should go to a phase 2 because you want to sort of you don't want to sort of do all of your requirements gathering and then 2 years later put in a system. So that's not how things work anymore, really. And so that within your budget and what might be in your budget next year might involve some change management and some thinking of it differently. And that phase 2 really will happen, as opposed to, oh, I've been burned before, phase 2 is never going to happen.
You should also set the expectation with your board also.
Yes.
That is very important. And, because if you do decide to phase things out, explain why explain why there is a need to phase things out so that they, know that it's more than a 12-month budget cycle that they're looking at.
Right. And one of the things why I was always resistant to a phase 2 was not just, well, what if it doesn't happen? But we had members calling and saying, well, why doesn't this change? How come this didn't change? And so it's that member management. Those 4 things were, with the 5 adding as vendor management, those 5 key things aren't just what do you do before an RFP, but sort of throughout, managing your member expectations of the phase, managing your staff's expectation of the phases, all of that sort of will come into play.
So we had another question come into the chat, and I think it relates well here to the apples or oranges slide, but it's a slightly different topic. But The question asks, how do you, separate from writing the RFP, how do you select vendors who will receive that RFP? How do you find and create the best short list of those vendors or even consultants to target so that you can sort of start the process?
That is a great question.
So I mean that I would say there are a couple really good resources in AMS Fest, which happens, I think, twice a year, and then ASAE Tech and ASAE Annual. So ASAE Annual is actually happening, I think, a week from Friday is the demo day, where a lot of the AMS CRMs are going to do like a quick half-hour demo. You're going to get super high level, generic, not to you. So it's a good sense of like, oh, this is one I want to make sure to send out the RFP to. This is someone that I can just tell them that half hour wouldn't be the right fit. So as far as the who to send the RFP to for a solution, if you don't go with a consultant who can do that, there are resources with ASAE and AMS Fest that give you a good sense of what other association systems are out there. But how to go about picking a consultant? I mean, obviously, I'm a little biased right now and think Tammy's great, but I mean, do you want to talk about how someone would go
Thanks,
about?
Beth.
Yeah, so
I appreciate that.
Do you want to give like how they would find you or someone like you?
Sure. So like Beth mentioned, using and leveraging the ASAE, technology conference or annual conference, that's a really great place to network, not only with exhibitors where you can find lots of consultants that do this from an exhibiting perspective, but also networking with other associations that are in your same shoes who have either just gone through or have previously gone through a selection and have leveraged a consultant. Networking is a really, really key source of information. And the other area that I'll just sort of piggyback on what Beth mentioned is that AMS Fest. I find that to be a really great resource to get exposure to a wide variety of different AMS solutions. But a lot of the consulting organizations are there as well, and you can interact and ask questions in that capacity as well. So those are both really great opportunities.
I love your suggestion about networking. I think that's, one of the ways that everybody can sort of benefit from groupthink is sort of understanding how experiences that you've had in the past or your colleagues have had from different associations can really lend a hand to sort of helping you narrow down how you think about those things. So I think it's a great answer.
Yeah, I see that a lot in Collaborate for ASAE, where the conversations really sort of, it's such a collaborative community. And so there are a lot of resources out there, and so don't be afraid to sort of ask a question of another association that is maybe similar to you, or there's just a lot of great resources out there.
So, and kind of continuing this conversation, we had another question come in. It says, is it appropriate to ask a company about any financial disclosures they have with suppliers? For example, a web redesign company recommends a CMS supplier who does a revenue sharing with that web redesign company. Is that appropriate to ask?
I would say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is in your best interest to ask those questions and know what the answer is. And then ultimately you can make your decision one way or the other based on what their response is. I absolutely think that's appropriate.
And it may be just because they say they have a financial sort of, partner share type relationship with another vendor, it doesn't mean that that's bad. I mean, it might be that like, yeah, I recommend this company a lot because I have found it because you're hiring me for my expertise, and my expertise shows that this company is a good fit for lots of my clients. And so that's why I have this share. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that they have it, but it is definitely something to that you should be upfront, I mean, that you should ask about. Yeah, I don't see any reason why not to.
So I do see there's a follow-up question about that in regards to where they can find an RFP template for a web redesign. And just from my own experience, Google is an incredible and powerful tool. And if you search, if you do enough searching, you can probably find other RFPs for web redesigns from existing organizations that are out on the internet that you can, use and take what you like, use what you like, and then just kind of take several and morph them together into something that works for you.
Yeah, I know that at the American Bar Association, we were required as part of that policy to post our RFPs on the website to be open for a period of time. I know that a lot of government agencies sort of require that. So there are lots of RFPs just that are currently out there as open RFPs for, so you can find templates, but you can also find sort of real world examples as well.
And I'll sort of jump in and sort of suggest one of our favorites is ASAE Collaborate. I think that's a great place where association executives can kind of ask questions like that, and other associations will share that information willingly.
Yeah, I have found on Collaborate, people are very willing to share.
So that sort of goes to the next item that we sort of want to talk about. And so as you're sort of thinking about this organizational and cultural fit, a recent study by Third Coast Consulting said that the type of software that you implement has less of an impact on the success of an implementation than the people you're working with. So getting a feel for that vendor, both during the RFP process and how they answer those questions, and then in the demo, will give you lots of opportunity to sort of make sure that you do have that good organizational and cultural fit, because a lot of the software varies in sort of, but a lot of it, the basics are sort of there across the board. And so that there are definitely lots of features that you want to look at across the board with the different solutions. And so there are reasons to look at just the tech, and the people, will go away and the tech stays. And so that tech is super important, but these are people you're going to work with a lot. And so finding that good fit and making sure that you like the people that you're going to be working with for a while. I think there's a lot of value in that study that the people are what make a product or a project successful. So what comes next? So Tammy, can you talk about the timeline of how all this usually works?
Sure, absolutely. So from a time frame perspective, I couched this in terms of how much time do you give a vendor to respond to the RFP. And the typical time frame that I've seen is somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks. Obviously you want to take into consideration holidays or vacation time, but typically 3 to 4 weeks, I think, is a sufficient amount of time for a vendor to respond. And remember that it is okay to have your vendors ask you questions about the content in the RFP. It's not like you're not breaking any bad rules by keeping mum about everything. Allow them to ask questions. Ultimately, you want them to be on the same page with what it is that you're asking. You want them to fully understand what the requirements are that you're talking about. And maybe it makes sense to you, but it might not make sense to them. So there's no reason to keep them in the dark about, answers to some of the questions.
I wish I had had that advice a long time ago. So learn from my mistake. Somewhere I was told to worry a lot about the ethics of it and sort of conflict of interest and business conduct standards. And so I was so afraid to talk to a vendor because I didn't want to appear biased and wanted to be part of the decision making. And so I didn't want to oh, I know somebody from this company and I don't want to talk to them. And I get so sort of anxious about it. And so there are ways to sort of still get the vendor. So one, I think I went to the extreme, and so please learn from my mistake. But one of if there are concerns about that, and even if you do talk to one vendor, you can always sort of post, all right, here was a clarifying question. Let me clarify that question with everyone else in case someone else has that concern. And so you can still even the playing field just because you've talked to one vendor, but it's okay to talk to the vendor. And I wish that I had learned that lesson a long time ago.
So when it comes to the demo, when it comes to demos, Beth, can you tell us about that aspect of the process?
Sure. So there are, I think, two ways to sort of go about like the scripting. So you might have the vendor develop the script and just you have sign off on sort of the agenda of it so that they can sort of present their best foot forward. But what is probably more likely that you're going to do is either have you or the consultant that you're working with come up with an agenda so that you are, back to the inevitably you're going to compare some apples to oranges, but you want to get as close to sort of apples to apples. And so having a consistent script will really help with that. And once you have sort of just on top of that, that really is, even if you don't talk to the vendor much before sort of the selection process of selecting who you're going to demo with. At that point, having these pre-demo calls with the vendors, you want them to have the best opportunity to present what they have to offer. And so having them being able to ask those questions at that point, even if you're a little resistant before they submit the RFP, talking to them about what you're looking for to clarify things. It goes back to that folding a piece of paper. It's exciting to see how somebody might do them differently, but if you need a paper folded one very specific way, make sure they understand that. And a good way to do that is scorecards. Can you talk about scorecards, Tammy?
Yeah, I absolutely will, but I'm going to just add something about demos real quick. Earlier, Beth, you were talking about inside baseball and like the specific terminology that either a client uses, organization uses, or the vendor might use. So keeping that in mind when you're watching the demo is important also, because even though the vendor may not be speaking the exact language of your business rules, that doesn't mean that the capability can't meet the needs for your business rules. So I'm just going to give an example. And again, I apologize, it's going to be an AMS example, but a vendor may call it a section. They may have section management and they may talk for 25 minutes about sections, but you don't have sections, you have chapters. So you sometimes have to be able to use some forethought and make the connection that what it is that they're talking about using the word sections really could mean chapters to you. So don't be discouraged if the terminology doesn't match exactly with what your organization uses. But if the functionality exists, you can use it for your specific purpose. Doesn't matter what the terminology is.
That's a really good point and a good one of the steps when we haven't talked about this, but that sort of brings to mind having sort of a pre-demo meeting internally so that this may be your second or third RFP process. And so to think of it sort of differently, but there might be users from different departments who would hear sections and think, well, that's not applicable to me, and then stop listening for 20 minutes. So having sort of a reset at the beginning, so reset is the wrong word, but sort of having a kickoff internally of like, all right, so we're going to see the demo of these 3 vendors and keep in mind an open mind about terminology or what have you. That's a good sort of reset on your end.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you. So I'm going to talk briefly about scorecards because scorecards is definitely a tool that can benefit you not only when looking through the RFP responses, but also through the demos. I highly recommend using a scorecard. As you're going through, you can rate, the responses or rate the demos based on a whole variety of different criteria. And one of the main reasons why it's so important is because RFP fatigue and demo fatigue is a real thing. After you've read 3 or 4 or 5 RFP responses, or after you've seen the 3rd or 4th demo, sometimes the features get muddied between which company has which feature. And so having a scorecard where you can not only rate them based on that, based on a particular requirement, but you can also take notes about it. That will be very helpful when you're starting to narrow down the playing field. And it will allow you to anticipate additional questions that you might need to drill into further. So I highly recommend using a scorecard and a score sheet when going through the RFP process and the demo process.
Yeah, it's so important. So we have just a couple minutes for any additional questions, but just so you know that this is how you can reach either one of us. Again, Tammy Marco is with A Church Consulting, and I am here with Altai Systems. We talked a bit about ASAE annual meeting. Altai is doing one of those demos next Friday. So certainly if you are in the market, that's a good day to see lots of vendors do their demos, including us. Chris, have any other questions come through the chat that we need to cover in these last couple minutes?
We just had a really good one come through, and I'll be curious to hear what your answers are. But it says, if there was just one thing you wished everyone realized about submitting a good RFP, what would it be?
Oh, that's a...
And I need to think on that one for a minute.
One thing, I think my one thing is the yes, no questions. Like, be really careful about those yes, no questions, because I was interviewing once a couple years ago, and someone asked in an interview, do you consider yourself a kind person? And I made a joke about it because I'm like, who's going to say no to that question? And so everyone's going to say yes, and yet the world would be a better place if we were all kinder than we probably are. And so yes, no questions only get you so far. And so I think that's my one big thing. Just be careful about how many yes, no questions.
I fully agree with you about the yes, no questions. The one thing that I was going to mention is, when you are, I'm going to go back to the high level requirements and not going into the requirements that are so detailed, because the way that systems have evolved, the way that you do things currently may not be the same way that things are going to be taking place in the future. So try to elevate your question, ask it in a detailed enough way, but don't be so detailed that you're just trying to replicate what you already have.
Yes. Don't replicate what you already have. That's such a good, that's the takeaway. Chris, anything else as we close out?
No, I really appreciate that. Was a great question. And here's one more from Andrew. It says, did an RFP on time and asked if the platform would do 4 different things. They answered yes, but the platform could not do all 4 at the same time.
See that value? And again, who's going to say they're unkind in a job interview?
Anyways, thank you very much to everybody that joined us today. And thank you especially to Tammy, who joined us from A Church Consulting, and to you, Beth. I think this was a really fantastic webinar. Hopefully we'll hear back from all of you. We did get a question about CAE credits. And in case you didn't see that, I'll be sending an email by the end of the week that'll have that credit for you to put in your file, so that as you reapply or apply for the first time, you'll be able to utilize that.
Great, and thank you, Chris, for managing the chat for us, and thanks again for everyone attending, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.